Good morning, students. We are back to the lecture on post-colonial studies. Again, post-colonial studies. In the last classes, we were dealing with two areas of intellectual studies which tried to give an understanding of post-colonialism. The first one was the emergence of Commonwealth literature. We tried to identify the genesis of Commonwealth literature and the gradual change in the definition starting from colonial conferences, imperial conferences, and later into Commonwealth conference, and how Commonwealth has no existence in the present state. It has no constitution, no legal authority, and even the membership is not compulsory. And then we talked about the contributions of Commonwealth critics and how they were preoccupied with identifying a common goal shared among Commonwealth writers and how they provided a liberal humanist approach. They treated Commonwealth literature as a subset of canonical English literature, and they tried to evaluate these in terms of conventional values of timelessness and universality. We have discussed all these things. In the last part, we were trying to say that Commonwealth literature, though it is outdated, it is still an important category of artistic endeavor, and it actually ensured Commonwealth literature and attention and space in Western colleges, and it also it laid the foundation for various post-colonial criticisms. And then we move to the second area of intellectual study, that is theories of colonial discourses. Here we are focusing mainly on the theories of Frantz Fanon and Edward Said. And I narrated an anecdote by Sam Selvin in which I tried to stress the point that it is actually all those representations and modes of seeing, ways of seeing, which are to be considered as the fundamental weapons of colonial power. So colonialism basically suggested certain ways of seeing, certain modes of understanding the world. Basically, when we defined colonialism, we understood that it is a group of people coming over to a different territory and taking control of that territory. So that definition essentially dealt with some kind of a physical process, a physical movement. But now I'm taking that a little forward. It was not that physical movement alone. Along with that, there was something known as colonizing the mind. And here we understand the role of language. Language, as we know, it is not simply a means of communication. It actually constituted our worldview. And as Ngugi says, it doesn't passively reflect reality, it actually creates an understanding of the world and also houses the values which we live. And here, I'm trying to stress the point that language actually projected certain values, certain colonial sets of values as best and truest, a proper, and both the colonizer and the colonized were made to internalize that colonial sets of values. And it actually provided, it was something like a traumatic experience for the colonized. And here we discuss a specific work by Frantz Fanon. It is Black Skin, White Mask, and how it recorded the psychological damage done by French colonialism, how they were denied the right to define their own identity, and how they tried to find a way out. So it was something like an escape and that was by embracing the civilized value, by donning the white mask of civilization, which ended up in disaster. And now we move to the second part of this theory of colonial discourses. We have a focus of study in this paper, Orientalism by Edward Said. So it came out in the year 1978 and it is considered to be one of the most influential books of the late 20th century. And here in this book, Edward Said looks at the divisive relationship between colonizer and the colonizer and the colonized from a different angle. So both Edward Said and Frantz Fanon were trying to explore the extent to which this colonialism created a way of seeing the world, an order of things which is considered to be true and proper. So both were trying to explore that that concept of ways of seeing the world. So they tried to stress the point that ways of seeing is actually the fundamental weapon of colonial rulers. But they both have a different approach. Edward Said gave more attention to the colonizers than the colonized, while Frantz Fanon gave the perspective of the colonized. So he actually talked about the psychological damage done to the colonized people. So he took a perspective from the side of the colonized, while Edward Said focused on the colonizer. And he used Marxist theories of power, especially the political philosophies of Italian intellectual Antonio Gramsci and also France intellectual Michel Foucault. So we will be dealing with their ideas when we focus this specific text, when we go to the introduction part. So briefly, we should say that in Orientalism, Edward Said tried to examine how knowledge produced by colonizers about colonized helped continually to justify their subjugation. Western nations like France and Britain, he argued that, spend an immense amount of time producing knowledge about the locations they dominated. So his idea is that they continuously produced knowledge which gave them their justification, the justification that these people are always to be subjugated. So according to Edward Said, all these Western nations like France and Britain were producing immense amount of knowledge about these colonized people, and through that they were trying to give out the justification for the subjugation. Edward Said was particularly focusing on Egypt and Middle East and how they were represented in variety of written materials. And here Edward Said was trying to point out that these Western travelers who came to these places, mainly Egypt and Middle East, they never tried to learn about this place or learn about these people, native people they encountered. Instead, they recorded their observations, which was mainly based on commonly held assumptions about the Orient as a mythic place of exoticism, a land of moral laxity, which was actually peopled by a people or who were sexually degenerate. So all their works were based on the works of these Western travelers were based on these observations they made about this land. So when they come to this land, they have an assumption that this is a land, for example, in the case of India, they they believed that India was the land of snakes and snake charmers. So all their written materials were colored by these assumptions, and these assumptions were projected as scientific truths, which in turn functioned to justify their very propriety of colonial domination. And this is the way colonialism perpetuated itself, it continued. So there was a group of Western travelers who made an assumption about this land. So they had this thing in their mind that they are coming to this land which is very exotic, which is very mysterious, contains a group who is morally degenerate, sexually degenerate, and they believed that that is something which is true, and they projected these beliefs as scientific truths. And knowledge so produced endlessly generated a degenerate image of the Orient for those in the West or the Occident. We should say that both Frantz Fanon and Edward Said inspired a new generation of literary critics in the 1980s who were keen to apply their ideas to the reading of literary text. Actually, Frantz Fanon actually showed that how these works at a psychological level, while Edward Said demonstrated the legitimation of empire for the observer. So they showed that empires actually colonized imaginations. And Frantz Fanon showed from a psychoanalytical dimension, and Edward Said showed how it was legitimated, it became legitimized for the oppressor. So basically, their point is overturning colonialism is not just handing over land back to its dispossessed people. It is not easy as returning power to those who were once ruled by empire. It is not something like a smooth process like that. So, ending colonialism, it is not just handing over the land to the oppressed or giving back what they had to their original settlers. Edward Said and Frantz Fanon was trying to tell that it is also a process of overturning the dominant ways of seeing the world and representing the world which do not actually replicate colonialist values. So, if colonialism involved colonizing the mind, then resistance to it requires what Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, decolonizing the mind. Here the point is that ending colonialism, it is not just giving back the land to the original settlers, it is also overturning that dominant ways of seeing, that representation of reality, and it essentially included decolonizing the mind. So this is very much an issue of language. So freedom from colonialism comes not just from the signing of declarations of independence and rising of new flags and lowering of the earlier flag of the colonizer. It is not easy as like that. Just signing declaration of independence or rising a new flag will not bring will not bring a new face. There must be also something known as change in minds, a challenge to the dominant views, a challenge to the dominant ways of seeing. So, this is a challenge to those from both the colonized and colonizing nations. People from all parts of the empire need to refuse the dominant languages of power that have divided them into master and slave, the ruler and the ruled. And as Franz Fanon says, a man who has a language consequently possesses the world expressed and implied by that language. The ability to read and write otherwise to rethink our understanding of the order of the things contributes mainly to the possibility of change. So we need to rethink our understanding of the world, which try to project certain sets of values as true and proper. So we need to rethink that. We need to write and think otherwise. And that actually contributed to the possibility of change. So in order to challenge the colonial order of things, we need to re-examine our received assumptions of what we have been taught as natural or true. Now we move to the next part, the turn to theory, post-colonial theory in 1980s. So the success of Orientalism inspired many critics, and it generated a new generation of critics who turned to more theoretical materials in their works. So beginning of postcolonialism, as we know, it is a departure from liberal humanist perspective, as we saw in Commonwealth literature. Now, in 1980s, we see the emergence of a new, dynamic, excitingly new form of textual analysis, which is notable for its eclecticism, and interdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, combining the insights of many theories like feminism, philosophy, psychology, politics, anthropology, and literary theory in many provocative and energetic ways. And here we identify three popular forms of textual analysis. So we are discussing 1980s. So the first part, a recap. First part, it was the first point is emergence of Commonwealth literature, the major antecedent of post-colonialism. Second one, theories of colonial discourses. And now we move to the theory. We come to post-colonial theory. And this is just before it takes its final shape. So in 1980s, we started with a new form of textual analysis, and these were the three popular forms of textual analysis. One involved rereading canonical English literature, and it actually tried to examine if past text perpetuated or questioned the latent assumptions of colonial discourses. And this form of textual analysis proceeded along two avenues. So the first one is rereading English canons, and here we try to examine all those past texts, all those texts written during the colonial period, and we try to analyze how they perpetuated or questioned all those latent assumptions of colonial discourses, and that they tried two different ways. Like, one is critics looked at writers who dealt directly with colonial themes and tried to analyze whether their work was supportive or critical of colonial discourses. And the example here is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So here, when these critics analyzed Heart of Darkness, they tried to understand how these novel perpetuated colonialist views in which these people, African people, were projected as inferior, and they try to question, and how this work try to question the entire colonial project. So that was the first method. They tried to all these critics, post-colonial critics. So this is the initial point of theory. So they took text and they analyzed these texts in two different ways. They studied the authors which directly dealt with these colonial themes, and they tried to understand whether they were supportive or critical of this colonial discourses. And the text is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And in the next way, it is they took all those texts which had nothing to do with colonial themes. So they analyzed works like Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and they reread these works and tried to understand, tried to go deeper into these texts and find out the strains of colonialism in these texts. And that was the first form of textual analysis. It is rereading all those canonical English literature and trying to identify whether they dealt explicitly or implicitly the colonial views. Now the second form of textual analysis, it is reading against the grain. It was actually influenced by all those post-structuralist thoughts given out by Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Lacan. And all these critics tried to inquire in particular into the representation of the colonial subjects in a variety of colonial texts. So if, as Edward Said claimed, that West produced knowledge about other people in order to prove the truth of their inferiority. So here their question was it possible to read these colonial texts against the grain and find moments when colonial subjects resist representation with recourse to colonial values? This issue was pursued in different ways from during the 1980s by two of the leading and most controversial post-colonial theorists, Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. And in his work on mimicry, so Bhabha has given out this concept of mimicry, in which he tried to explore the possibility of reading all those colonialist discourses as endlessly ambivalent, split, and unstable, and never able to install securely the colonial values they seem to support. So it was something known as reading against the grain. So they were trying to analyze that moments in that text where these colonial subjects resisted their representations with the support of with recourse to colonial values. So Bhabha called this as mimicry, reading all those colonial discourses and identifying that ambivalent, split, unstable point where these which couldn't support all those colonial values. And we have this Gayatri Spivak, who in her most influential essay, Subaltern Studies, explored the problem of whether or not it was possible to recover the voice of those who had been made subjects of colonial representations. And her focus was mainly towards women. And she tried to read them as potentially disruptive and subversive. Since the 1980s, Edward Said, Homi K. Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak actually opened a variety of theoretical issues central to postcolonialism, and they emerged as the holy trinity of critics working in the field. So this is the next form of textual analysis. So right now I am stopping here. So we are now at the initial point of postcolonial theory. We are nearing theory. We are just 2 steps behind. So we were looking at the 2 forms of textual analysis done by these critics. First is rereading all those canonical texts and identifying how these texts perpetuated or questioned the colonial assumptions. And that too takes 2 parts. They try to analyze those texts which directly dealt with directly dealt with colonial themes. For example, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And then in the second part, they analyzed all those works which had the theme of colonialism was hidden in all those texts, like Jane Eyre and Mansfield Park. So they took these texts and tried to identify all those colonial themes in that text. And the second form of textual analysis, it is reading against the grain. So They try to read all those colonial texts and try to identify the moments of colonial where these colonial subjects, colonized people, resisted their the representations projected by colonizer. And we have the concepts of subaltern and mimicry here. So we are right now stopping here, and I am giving you an assignment. Please identify the colonial themes in both these texts, that is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and the other one, Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. I told you that they had this colonial themes hidden in them. Your assignment is try to identify, try to bring it to the foreground, that colonial theme. What was the colonial themes which was something like hidden in these works? So I hope you have understood the lecture. If you have any doubts, please contact me. So thank you, girls. Have a nice day.